So I'm going directly to give the floor to Licinia for a presentation about financial aspects of projects in the program. It's up to you, Licinia.
Thank you, Sylvain. So good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's a pleasure for me to be here today from the operational finance team in Life. We're here to help you and guide you, and we hope that this presentation will give you some helpful tips and a structure where you can base yourself on how you will be able to translate your action, the activities that you want to achieve, the outputs that you want to produce into numbers. So how will you fill in your budget? And please keep the questions coming in Slido, which we will be looking after that, because we are limited on time here. So if you have specific questions, please put them in Slido. Next slide, please. I would start with the references, the links to the references for the documents that we really recommend you to have a look in. First is just where you can get the information. Most importantly, the call text, where you have there all the costs that are eligible or not. Then the model grant agreement. This is the grant agreement that you will be signing in case your proposal is selected. So please familiarize yourself with not only with the conditions for the cost, but all the other conditions for reporting, payments, etc. Then we have the next slide, which is the life. And sorry, can you go back to thank you. The life annotated grant agreement, which is precisely the comments, interpretations, tips from our services on the model grant agreement. And here you have really a lot of details about costs, examples, different scenarios. So please go to have a look. The last version is from April 2023. This is a live document. This is being updated. So please go to the reference document, to the portal, to see if there's a later version or not. And lastly, in case you will be selected for funding, you will be contacted by our services to validate your legal entity, in case you haven't got one, to get a PIC, the famous PIC, and also to assess your financial capacity in case you are a private coordinator. Now, if you intend to be the coordinator and you're private and you want to already have a look if you would have a good financial capacity or not, you can go into this link and you can make a self-assessment. And then you can have an idea, because if you will be weak, very probable you will be either asked to change to be to not be the coordinator, or for a financial guarantee. So this will already help you preempt some actions that you will need to undertake. Next slide, please. So here we dive into the roles in the grant agreement. So who does what? Who is responsible for what? Most important, of course, is the coordinator. They are our contact point. They sign the grant agreement. Beneficiaries are, of course, your partners. They are the other entities that participate in the grant agreement, and they sign it through the accession form. Then you have affiliated entities. Now, affiliated entities are linked to one of the beneficiaries. They will not sign the grant agreement, but they have the same conditions. They need to establish a legal or capital link to one of the beneficiaries, and it is this beneficiary who will remain responsible for them. Then we have associated partners. Please do not confuse this with Life Legacy. Associated partners, they implement certain actions, but they do not charge any costs and they do not claim any contributions. They also do not sign the grant agreement. So why do we have associated partners? Well, because they are entities that want to participate in your action. They have a role to play, but for some reason, they do not want to receive any contribution. Then you have subcontractors. So in case you are outsourcing any action task, either because you don't have the expertise or for another reason, then you will have subcontractors, but they will not be in the grant agreement. They will not sign it. For some actions, and in this case, in the CET call, it's only foreseen for the SAP, so the standard action projects. You can have recipients of financial support to third parties. These are entities that will receive either grants or prizes, and I will look into that later on. Then you have in-kind contributors. They will provide a service, but for free. So there will not be a translation into numbers, into costs or income in the budget. Basically, they will be silent participants in the action. Next slide, please. So how do you go about establishing your budget? Basically, there are two main components. The part A, and this, it's the overall budget table, and this you will fill in online. It will be per cost category, and we will look into that in a minute, and also per beneficiary and affiliated entity. The associated partner will have no costs, but will be in there. So there will be just one line with the name of the associated partner and then always 000 in all the costs. Then the next one that you have is the Annex 1 detailed budget table, which you will download the Excel format from the funding portal, and you will then have to upload. And here it is really detailed. You will start with the staff effort, and there please don't forget to include also the associated partners. Then you will go into the personal costs. You will need to put total costs, the person months, and then the average monthly rate will be indicated automatically. You will need to choose what cost category you will need to fill in the costs. You will need to provide then further a description, a justification, a breakdown of the costs that can enable us to understand the cost, what it is that you are doing, and how much it would cost. And this also in the subsections, subcontracting and other purchase of costs. We will go into that in a minute. Our main recommendation, please be realistic. Carefully think about all the activities that you will have, all the outputs, and make sure that you remember them and include them in the cost. And of course, you need to start by checking in the call document what are the costs that are eligible. Next slide, please. So check the call document. What is eligible, what is not eligible. You can only insert costs in euros. So please check all the costs and convert them into euros. There is an indirect costs flat rate of 7% on all direct costs except volunteer and land purchase. Unless it's not allowed, but for the CET Call it is allowed. And if by any chance you are an organization which already receives an operating grant, then normally indirect costs are not allowed unless you can demonstrate through your accounting system that the operating grant does not cover any costs of the action that you will be applying to. There is a particularity that we will see in a minute, the unit costs, daily rates, and these are for two types of personal costs, the SME or natural persons not receiving a salary, and at just below, you see here a link for the coefficient, the national coefficient, and then for the volunteer costs, the daily rates are indicated. And this you will find in the Annex 2A of the Model Grant Agreement. Next slide, please. So what are the specificities for the CET Call? The co-funding is at 95%, except for the SAP action, which is at 60%. And how is the payment structured? Well, first, if your action is selected for funding, you will receive a first pre-financing of 30% and then additional pre-financing. So here, no interim payment is foreseen. And then the final payment. Now, the amount of or the number of reporting periods is related to the type of action and the duration. And of course, this has an impact on the percentage which is then paid at each additional pre-financing. And so please, when you're structuring, when you're thinking of how you will be looking into what you will be doing when, think as well as this, and in terms of cash flow, this is important. Next slide, please. So what costs are eligible? We invite you to go into Article 6 of the Model Grant Agreement, where you have this main criteria. This is the general main criteria for us to check, is a cost okay, eligible or not? So it needs to be incurred by the beneficiary, by you or your affiliated entity, and during the duration of the project. There are only a few exceptions. For example, the final reporting, which you will do, of course, after the project ends. And for example, the certificate on the financial statements, the audit, in case you will be requested to provide one, in case you reach the threshold. It needs to belong to one of the budget categories of the call, so it needs to be foreseen originally in your grant agreement. Otherwise, you will have to do in most cases an amendment, not always, but most of the time. It needs to be directly related to the action and necessary for the implementation of your action. Identifiable, verifiable in the accounts of the beneficiary. So in case we ask you for some SAP accounting extracts, you should have them. You should have supporting documents to demonstrate this. And remember that your action may be subject to an audit. Next criteria, it needs to be compliant with applicable national law on taxes, labor, and social security. And last but not least, reasonable, justified, and comply with the principle of sound financial management. This means that if we find your a particular cost not justified, excessive, we reserve the right to not consider the cost eligible and reject it. Next slide, please. So what cost categories do we have? So where are you going to put your costs? Either personal costs, either subcontracting, purchase of costs, travel and subsistence, equipment, other goods, works and services, or other categories, which are normally not allowed in CET with the exception of the SAP actions, which is financial support to third parties and land purchase. So already when you're thinking about your action, about your costs, have always this image in mind, where do I put the costs? Next slide, please. So here we are going into the first big category, which is personal costs. And I will start with the first one, A1, which is the most common, if you will. So these are costs for employees and equivalent. And what are these costs? Salaries, social security contribution, taxes, remuneration, anything which arrives from national law or your usual accounting practices. The next category is A2, A3, natural persons, seconded persons. So natural persons working a direct contract or another type of employment contract. Seconded persons by a third party, but against payment. And these are eligible with two additional conditions. First, the work conditions must be similar to those of an employee in what concerns the way the work is organized, the tasks, the premises, teleworking conditions, for example. And the result of the work needs to belong to you, unless you agree otherwise with these persons. The next category is SME owners or natural persons not receiving a salary. And here you have the unit costs calculated in a particular way. And if you are an SME owner or natural person receiving a salary, then it should be in the A1 category. Okay. A5 volunteers. So this is a very particular category of costs, because this is the only cost which is really not incurred, meaning you really don't pay. These are persons that work for you freely. It's not compulsory, and you don't transfer them any money. You don't make them a payment at the end of the month. But they need to also comply with certain criteria, namely unit cost. Next slide, please. So here, how do you calculate these costs? You need to look at the average annual salary of each employee, divided by 2, and then multiplied by the person months of the project. We really urge you to look into the annotated grant agreement, because the way the personal costs are calculated has drastically changed from the life legacy. For example, this is one of the points that has changed. Now you need to calculate the day equivalents per person, and you cannot claim more than 215 a year. So please go into the annotated grant agreement to check this out. In terms of A2 and A3 personnel, it really depends on the type of contract or secondment rate which is stated in the contract. And again, this cannot differ drastically from your employee. So the salary, the amount which is paid cannot be very different from what you pay your employees. Next slide, please. In terms of A4 personal costs, you need to go into the Annex 2A as indicated. It's a unit cost, and this is how it's calculated. You always divide 5,080 by 18, you get this amount, 282.22, and then you multiply by the country specific, which I indicated the link earlier on. Very important here is that you can demonstrate how you calculated the number of days for this person. And then you need to have supporting documents later on in the reporting in case your proposal is selected for funding. In terms of volunteers, this is also the same. So there's a daily rate per country. So you need to go there to check what it is. And two other conditions at the level of preparation of your proposal. The maximum 50% of total project costs and contributions in the proposal, and the maximum EU contribution cannot be higher than the total eligible costs without volunteers. So this is a kind of complicated. So what I normally do is I have an Excel file, I put a formula, and then I calculate, and then you should be okay. So I recommend you to do this as well. Then later on at reporting, you cannot exceed the amount that you have foreseen at your proposal. So if you indicate in your proposal, I don't know, 5,000, you cannot then claim at the end 6,000. So please be very careful on how you calculate these costs. Next slide, please. Here we go into the second main category of costs, which is subcontracting. So, of course, it needs to fulfill the general eligibility conditions. It needs to comply with certain purchasing practices, best value for money, and ensure no conflict of interest. You can only cover parts of the action. Normally it's 30%, otherwise you need to justify it. And additionally, if you are a contracting authority or entity, you will also have to comply with EU directives on public procurement. And something which is not allowed to subcontract is, of course, the coordination of the action. This needs to stay in the consortium. This needs to stay with the coordinator. Next slide, please. So I understand I'm running a little bit out of time, so I will not go into each of details of the slides, but you have them here for your convenience. So there is sometimes some doubts on what constitutes subcontracting or purchase of cost, which is the section C we will be going to next. And the main decisive way you can separate the two is if you look if subcontracting is outsourcing an action task. So a main part of your action identified in the work packages. Okay. For example, if it concerns the certificate for financial statements, translation of documents, publication of brochures, this is not subcontracting. This will go into purchase of costs. Also, meeting for rooms, catering for an event, hiring of consultants, legal expert, IT consultants. This is also normally purchase of costs. If you are outsourcing energy audits, for example, though, this would seem to be subcontracting. So in case of doubt, put in subcontracting, and then if your proposal is selected for funding, we can always go back to you for clarification. Next slide, please. I move into the third category of costs, the purchase of costs. Travel and subsistence, the line to take is that you follow your usual practices. Next is equipment. It depends on the conditions. Here for the CET Call, all the substrands, only the depreciation is allowed except the XAP actions. We will see that in the next slide. So here you can only claim depreciation of costs, only what has been actually incurred according to your usual practices and international standards, of course, and only for the rate of the action, of course, only during the duration of the project. If you decide to rent or to lease, you can do that, but the costs cannot exceed the depreciation of similar equipment. Next slide, please. So we are here in the situation where you are in an SAP action, and here the equipment can be depreciated in a different way. So basically you have two options within this option. The full cost or the depreciation of listed equipment. So if you go for depreciation, you need to list the equipment. You need to clearly indicate in Annex 1, detailed budget, what you will be depreciating. If, however, you comply with Annex 5, the durability clause, this is Annex 5 of the Model Grant Agreement, you can declare the full cost, but there are conditions. It needs to be purchased and developed specifically for your action, and you need to commit to use it and maintaining using it after the end of the action for activities pursuing the action's objectives, and then for at least 5 years after the end of the action or until it's fully depreciated, whichever is earlier. And of course, this cost needs to be recorded in a fixed asset account and comply with the usual rules, international and your usual practices. Next slide, please. I see Zoe's. Yes, we need to close. Okay. So this is very straightforward. I will just say that it's the purchase of costs. Some examples are indicated. Certificate for financial statements. Here is the threshold, 500,000 if you claim EU contribution, and this is per beneficiary and affiliated entity. Next slide, please. Okay, I will not go into details for this because this is only for SAP actions. It's not very current comment in CET projects, but just bear in mind a couple of tips. If we go into the next slide, please, which is if you plan to do this, if you plan to give support to third parties, to third entities outside, next slide, please, sorry. And you plan to do either a grant or a prize, please indicate in your proposal, in one single section of your proposal, how you will address all of these criteria. It is very important for us to know in detail, as much as possible, as you know already, how you will calculate the amount you will give, the criteria for giving this, who will be benefiting. So this is very important and needs to be in the proposal. Next slide, please. This is for land purchase. Basically, you need to have it in the database. You need to comply with several very specific criteria, which you will have here in the slides. And then if you have doubts, please put a question in Slido or contact us. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is just more details on land purchase. And next slide, please. Indirect costs we have already foreseen, so I just wanted to point it out. You have it here in the slides for your convenience. Next slide. A list of not eligible costs. So you will see here very important VAT. We have very common error of claiming VAT, which is deductible or refundable, which is not eligible. Next slide, please. Double funding, you cannot use another EU project to fund this proposal, and then other examples of non-eligible funding. For example, for public organizations, activities that are already normal activities of the administration are not eligible. Next slide, please. No, this I want to just spend 1 minute on. So these are frequent errors that we see in proposals. For example, SME owners not receiving salary indicated in A1 when they should be in the section A4, unit costs. When the threshold is reached, the certificate for financial statement is missing in the Annex 1 or is too expensive. The subcontracting of actions which are not action tasks, so they should not be in subcontracting. For equipment, please clearly indicate if this is depreciation or full cost, or listing the equipment. The financial support that we don't receive all of the criteria clearly explained, and sometimes all over the proposal in different sections. So it's very difficult for us to find this information and to see if you comply or not with this. And also finally, a tip also for clarity of your proposal. In the Annex 1 detailed budget, sometimes we get a big cost and there's no explanation, there's no details, so we do not know how do we assess this. Is this eligible, not eligible? What does this correspond? So if you have a big cost, please put at least some details so that we understand what the cost is and how you calculated this cost. And this is where I terminate. My next slide is just to thank you for your attention. I hope it has been useful. And of course, we remain available for your questions in Slido. Thank you.